The Hudson forgot gravity. Water climbed the air like a sheet being yanked upward by an invisible hand. A glossy wall catching sunrise and siren blues. Battery Park turned to screaming metal and slipping shoes. Naima Torres felt the first crack in the world as a low pulse pressed through her ribs. Her radio, untouched, slid to 108.4 on its own. A tiny heart icon blinked. The patient on the pavement seized, then went dead still. Not from lack of breath, but from the way the city seemed to hold its breath for her. The word arrived without a mouth to carry it. Listen. Naima locked an airway, counted compressions, watched the monitor trace a line that was not a heart rhythm, but a clean sine wave locked to the radio's number. The pulse rolled through the stones under her knees. She thought ozone copper storm. She thought this is not a call sign, this is a verdict. The woman's pupils refracted something behind Naima. She turned. Black spheres punched through the rising wall of water and shot inland, throwing spray across the promenade. They moved in disciplined spirals, always adjusting, always converging, as if an animal was sniffing for the place where the city hid its soul. One sphere paused over a bronze memorial, lasered its own reflection into the metal, then jetted away. Fire alarms woke on their own. A gull fell mid-flight. Not cut, just switched off. Naima hauled the patient into the rig, barked a route, found the wheel in her hands and the far lane already opening like a throat. She hated superstition, but thought it anyway. The city is moving me. The radio kept its number. When she hit the World Trade Center drop-off, the ground under the Oculus answered the pulse with one of its own. Faint but undeniable. Below, Theo Park had been on a nothing-shift checking track circuits when the rails hummed like tuning forks. His oscilloscope climbed into a clean spike at 108.4 and stayed there like it had been waiting years to show him what it really was. He pressed his ear to the rail and tasted battery metal and old dust. A driverless train came in hard on emergency braking, wheels screaming, sparks showering the platform in blue snakes. A sphere drilled the far wall, unfolded a spray of needle-sized drones, and the column beside Theo took a perfect diagonal cut, as if reality had decided to demonstrate geometry. Fear flipped to focus. He dragged a tourist back from a shower of stone, jammed a wedge under a buckling door, patched a bypass across a fried relay with hands that finally stopped shaking. The rail hum rose, fell, settled again. It was not temperature. It was not current. It was a rhythm mapped onto the bones of the transit system. The city had a heartbeat and someone else was matching it. Above, on a low Chinatown rooftop, Yelena Morozov pinned a battered notebook under her elbow, fingers flicking a tuner across dead air and pirate chatter. 108.4 landed in her headset like a coin dropped into a glass. It was not a command. It behaved like a mirror held up to whatever was already in the room. She marked 3 words in block letters. Echo, not order. Then a 4th. Verdict. When the jammer slid into view 2 blocks over, a plain van with an ugly comb of shortwave teeth, she felt relief the way a chess player feels at last seeing the villain piece. Of course there would be a hand that hates resonance. Of course something named Mute would try to choke the city before it learned its own song. She lashed her antenna to a water tower, spliced a cable with her teeth, and brought a makeshift relay alive. The meter quivered, dipped, then brightened. The number held. Times Square detonated into glass weather. Screens did not shatter randomly. Each blew outward along the same ripple, as if a stone had been thrown into a lake of pixels. The frozen image on every board was the same, an iris filling the world, a skyline bending inside it. A mirror face fell from one billboard like a diver cutting into air. No mouth, no eyes, only a glossy mask that took Times Square and gave it back as waves. Spheres strafed. A cruiser lifted on its own tires and came down wrong. Somewhere a vendor screamed about his cart, absurd and perfectly human. Naima vaulted a barrier and covered an officer on the ground, felt heat bite her cheek, tasted grit. The mirror face did not chase. It observed, micro-tilts reading the way a crowd chooses. A sphere shot past Naima's shoulder and seared a vertical line in a support beam, then adjusted and fired again at a different angle. Not hunting bodies, mapping spaces, measuring the city's flex and give. The radio cut to a tone that was not quite sine anymore. It carried breath, a curve at the top like a chest hesitating before it lets go. Listen, the city insisted. She was already listening and it hurt. Theo hit street level with a battery pack on a sling and a toolkit he should have dropped, but didn't. MTA to Times Square was a sprint across a city that had traded lanes for shockwaves. He found Naima by instinct, and the way her shoulders faced the wrong way for a civilian. He did not know her, but he knew how she stood. He shouted without words. She read his hands. The two of them moved like partners who had been arguing for a decade. Yelena's number flashed on the rig phone with no caller ID. She did not introduce herself. She said the arch under the Manhattan Bridge. She said rhythm circle. She said your number is not telling you what to do. It is telling you what you already are, when you stop pretending you are separate from the place you live. She cut the line because time in a city like this is blood. The West Side Highway became a bad choice for a person in a van who liked causing silence. The Spheres did not seem to see the jammer as a threat until it did its job well. When it did, they recognized it and chased with the same cold focus they used to cut columns. Yelena stood on the median and aimed a thing that should not have worked at a target that should not have been that dumb. The coil spat a dirty arc. One sphere inverted itself into sparkling dust. The others learned and shifted tactics. The van fishtailed, clipped a taxi, regained control. Yelena felt the old soldier from a country she had left stand up inside her shoulders. She reloaded. The arch under the bridge held cold the way old stone does, a particular temperature that has nothing to do with weather. Naima and Theo came in from opposite ends of the underpass and stopped at the chalk that had not been drawn by a human hand. The circle pulsed in a way recognizable to anyone who had ever counted compressions or watched a rail diagram breathe. They put their palms near the line and let the breath settle them. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The radio matched. The rails matched in Theo's memory of the sound. The city matched because it had been trying to from the first moment, and finally felt permission. The mirror face arrived not by walking, but by becoming thicker in the air until it occupied a volume. It turned and the bridge cables reflected across it as cords. Naima watched herself on that face and did not hate what she saw. Fear moved aside to make room for clarity. She wanted words, then suspected words had been the problem all morning. She let the number be an instrument instead of an instruction. A swarm poured through a vertical ripple and fanned to either side of the arch. Theo spun the oscillator in his kit to 108.4, then pushed past it into a fractional inversion he felt more than calculated. The wave left him and hung above the chalk like a thin dome. The first ring of spheres entered that dome and fell like stones into water that was not there. They did not break. They switched off and hit the pavement with the weight of dead metal. The mirror face staggered as if its knees were concepts that had just been withdrawn. The mask rippled hard, failed to hold a clean reflection, caught itself, regained surface. Naima understood something she would not have believed if you had explained it to her the day before. They were not under attack by a mind that hated them. They were being audited by a system that could only work when a place could hear itself. Mute had more human fingerprints than whatever stood in front of her. Sirens tangled with river wind. A tram crossed the East River at the very edge of vision, and then hesitated. The pulse went thinner, as if it had moved to a higher octave. Her radio did not change channels, but delivered a simple coordinate like a hand placed on a shoulder. Roosevelt Island at sunset. The mirror face looked toward that line of river and cable. It did not nod and it did not speak. It receded until the arch held nothing but draft and dust. Naima's legs shook so hard her knees felt like bad hinges. Theo laughed the laugh people use when the adrenaline is still trying to decide whether to kill you. Yelena texted a single check mark followed by the same coordinate, then a second message that read in 3 clipped words, that the van got away. She added one more she had not meant to send. Keep breathing. The city resumed ordinary noises with the sheepish air of a person walking back into a room after a fight. Traffic embellished the beat. A saxophonist found a new scale because his old one felt silly. After watching water stand like glass, black dust drifted out toward the river and dissolved. The chalk circle dimmed but did not vanish. Naima thought of the first woman on the stones and felt a rising anger at a world that could do this and still let a single person die alone. Then the anger shifted shape and became resolve, heavier to carry and better to live with. On the long walk back to the rig, she saw people help each other stand without filming it. The air tasted like rain that had not fallen yet. The number held. The rule was simple and terrifying. When the city breathes together, the gate holds. When it doesn't, everything with a mask comes looking for what you forgot to hear. She keyed her mic and spoke a status that did not exist in any field manual. Pulse established. Rhythm viable. Moving to tram. The tram froze over the East River like an insect pinned to glass. 100 feet below, the current chopped itself into bright seams where stray beams from the last attack still bled in the water. The Roosevelt Island line hummed with stranded power, and the cabin swayed in a wind that was not strong enough to justify the movement. Naima looked up and saw a pattern she did not want to understand. The sway matched the number. Dispatch had no language for this and no bandwidth left for anything but triage. Theo said what his eyes could prove. The line stalled at midspan with at least 20 souls inside, maybe more if a tour group had decided to ride first thing in the morning. Yelena came up on an open channel he had no right to use and handed them the lifetime of a hacker in 5 words. The jammer is in motion northbound. A siren on the river wailed, then cut out. A small NYPD launch had crossed an invisible line of interference and lost its voice. The hull kept coming. The crew looked up at the tram like sailors at a storm cloud. They were not getting near enough to do anything but collect bodies if the cabin fell. Naima felt the old EMT calculus try to kick in and fail. Too high for ladders, too far for bucket trucks. No safe anchor on the Manhattan side where a forest of tourists had decided they needed to film the end of Strangers. The only path that made sense was the stupid one. Theo had already hauled a coil of cable out of a supply cage and attached a carabiner that should have been retired 5 years ago. He glanced at her for the argument that had to happen. She did not make it. He said the line can take body weight if we split it and double back. And he said it in that quick engineer monotone that means he is lying to keep your courage from checking the math. She said, take the dial and keep me on pattern if I drift. They ran the coil to a maintenance ladder, bolted an anchor into a beam that did not want to hold anything, and looked at each other for the one beat you owe a person, before you ask a thing that might damage them forever. She took the line, clipped in twice, checked both, and went over the rail. Air filled her jacket and turned it into a little sail. Her feet found the beam slower than her heart did. The metal felt greased with fog. The river breathed below and the city breathed around. Inside the cabin, people had moved from panic to the weird social freeze that comes between panic and action. A mother with a toddler pressed the child's ears while whispering instructions the child would not keep. A college kid live-streamed until his battery went flat, and then sat with his hands in his lap as if waiting for the teacher. An older woman took the inventory of people the way nurses do on airplanes, and asked directed questions without raising her voice. She had 4 answerers and 16 people who looked at each other for permission. The tram groaned as Naima stepped onto the support bracket and felt the shiver run through her knees. She announced herself without quotes and without heroics. City EMS, I'm here to get you off this car. We will do this by feel and breath. She reached the roof hatch and kicked it twice with the heel of her boot. It stuck, then popped. She dropped inside and smelled that garlic of fear and stale air. The college kid said he almost made it to 1,000 viewers. Naima said he was going to make it to 1,000 mornings if he tied in and did not do anything fancy. Theo's voice came through her radio with a click that lined up with her heartbeat. He gave her the new number as if it were a count for a dance. On 4 you move, on 8 you hold, on 12 you lock. The idea was simple, and had taken the city an entire day to teach them. The tram swayed and Naima timed her shifts so the sway became her ally. She set an anchor to the interior frame and turned the harness into a ferry line. First across was the older woman, because she had already demonstrated leadership, and a person like that can poison a rescue if you do not make her part of it. She moved like a dancer who has memorized where the floor will be in the dark. A teenage boy tried to cut the line with a joke about heights and swore he was fine until he looked down and saw the river take a breath. He locked up like a dog on a slick kitchen floor. Naima anchored herself and talked with her hands. His shoulders released and he crossed hand over hand as his breath found the count. The toddler crossed tied to his mother with a belt, and the mother discovered a tone she did not know she had buried under a layer of New York sarcasm. She used it like an instrument and surprised herself by listening to it. Outside, a cluster of spheres tested the skin of the tram like fish bumping a dock. Theo saw their pattern change and braced for a cut that would have split the car. The tone from his oscillator met the attempt head-on with a little quiver of static, and a result that he would later struggle to call anything but luck wearing a lab coat. 2 spheres veered and the third dropped as if embarrassed. The river ate it and made no splash. Across the water on a row of Chinatown buildings, Yelena chased the van by angles. She lacked a vehicle, but she had roofs and short distances, and a body that remembered scaling things in a different city a long time ago, for reasons that had never made it to paper. She took stairs 4 at a time, jumped gaps a 14-year-old messenger would brag about later, and came up under a row of laundry lines strung like international flags. The van passed below with the slow patience of a trap. She counted aerials, saw the clone on the roof, picked the real set by the way the harmonics misbehaved, and dropped a coil right where it would ruin someone's day. The EMP slingshot did not have safety certifications. The spark it spat kissed the jammer's backbone and sent a shudder through the neighborhood like a hiccup. For 1 second, the number went thin. For that second, a new sound slipped through, another fraction layered on the original frequency, like harmony finding its courage. Yelena grinned, then flinched as a needle drone found her by heat and came straight at her eyes. She snatched the antenna mast by pure reflex and stabbed the drone out of the air in a shower of sparks. Hands ringing, heart like a light bulb about to pop. The van accelerated, then made the mistake of thinking it had cleared the local threat and slowed to switch streets. Yelena snapped photos she could not send anywhere yet, and labeled them in her head with a discipline born from years of being the only archivist in a fight. Plate number. Damaged left taillight. Secondary aerial taped under the bumper. Decal residue on the rear window in the shape of a sports team she did not recognize. She spat a word her grandmother would have smacked her for and sprinted for the next vantage point. Back on the tram. The last cluster of passengers bunched near the hatch, and needed the kind of instruction that cuts in both directions. Naima told a man in a suit that he was going next because he had been performing helpfulness without taking risk, and other people had started to mirror him, and it had to end. He looked insulted, then contrite, then like someone who had been called back to a standard he secretly wanted to keep. He crossed better than anyone and set an example with the one thing people actually respect, which is action. 2 more, and then a third, a fourth. And then the teenager again, because he wanted to be the last. And Naima told him he could be second to last, and that the last would be her, or the city would never forgive her. She went up through the hatch and felt the car shift in a way that said the supports were tired of pretending they were bridges. The last person refused to move. He said he was not leaving because he wanted to see what stepped out of the sky next. He had the face of a man who had needed one big narrative to make his life feel like a story. She told him the story was breath, and that the ending only counts if you are alive to read it. He said he would go if she admitted she was scared. She said she was terrified and tied him in. They crossed. As they made the final transfer, a new formation came down the river at a speed that read as right angles to the human brain, not spheres and not mirror faces. An array of plates in a V shape throwing spray like silver fish. The plates pivoted and opened into a lattice that tested the air the way a palm tests a shower. The lattice stopped over the tram and held perfectly still, as if it had always intended to be a ceiling. Theo felt the number in his teeth. They were building something like a surface for the car to press against if the line failed. It was a rescue, or a demonstration, or both. Naima had the toddler in one arm and the line in the other. She did not meet the lattice with gratitude. She met it with a clean refusal to let anyone else own the narrative of who saved whom. She made her last move and rolled onto the support with her chest heaving, and a laugh in her throat that had nowhere to go. The car did not fall. The line twitched, then settled. The lattice lifted away as if satisfied with the test. Spheres ringed the scene but held a perimeter. The city had met the count. The gate stayed closed. On the promenade, a man in a hoodie shot video and provided loud running commentary for an audience that was either huge or imaginary. He caught Yelena on a roofline, framed her with the word hero at least 6 times, then panned to a convoy of SUVs coming up a service road with the kind of speed that means lights in the grill but not on the roof. The van that housed Mute tucked itself into a side street and vanished as if swallowed by brick. The SUVs fanned and formed a wedge around nothing, then peeled off again in a pattern a person with certain training would recognize. Yelena recognized it and wrote 2 initials in her notebook, against a line that read Handler. Theo met Naima on the shore and did the thing men do when they want to show gratitude without embarrassing, the feelings that walked them to this edge. He handed her a bottle of water and tapped the rail with his knuckles as if to thank the city personally. He told her the oscillator held at the number and inverted when the swarm tried to enter. She told him the car would have fallen without the line and without the people inside choosing to move. Each returned to the work that keeps hands from shaking. By afternoon, the city had run out of superlatives and started building jokes. A deli sign read half-off mirror glaze. Someone chalked a heart around a perfect circle of soot. The saxophonist on the corner found a new riff and looped it until it felt like a neighbor. The news trucks fought over curb rights and then gave up because the power trucks had seniority and better coffee. Then the screens in Midtown cut to a single frame again, not the iris this time. A topographic view of the island with a line, drawn in red from the bridge to the tram to the narrow strip of land that splits the river like a scar. Roosevelt. The coordinate pulsed once per second and a count began. In the corner in clean white numerals, 90 minutes. Yelena patched into every feed she could and tried to trace the origin. It did not route through any city system, and it did not bounce like a hack. It felt like a local transmission that refused to leave the geography it referenced, as if the island itself had learned to talk. She sat with that until the weirdness of it wore off, and then she accepted it, because cities make new organs when they need them. She called Naima and Theo, with an economy of language that comes from knowing that every extra syllable is disrespect. Meet at the southern tip. Bring the oscillator and chalk. Bring the breath. She did not say bring courage because they had already spent it, and guessed there might not be a refill. Traffic to the island clotted and then unkinked as if the roads could feel the count. People watched the numbers without understanding why it felt like an appointment, and not a trap. A man sold hot dogs with a grin that said business is business. A woman with a stroller chose to go home anyway and did not apologize to herself for it. A jogger stopped to offer a spare pair of gloves to a firefighter, and the firefighter took them and kept them because the wind refused to let anyone pretend they were stronger than they were. As the sun began to fall sideways through the buildings, a mirror face stepped out of the light on the western bank and faced the island. It stood with a posture that read as ritual. It cast no shadow that anyone could track. The mask rippled as if the river lived on its skin. Naima stood with the oscillator case at her feet and her hands empty. Theo drew a circle because that habit had become a prayer. Yelena scanned the rooftops for handlers who could not resist inserting themselves into history. The count reached 30. The wind turned. The river breathed. The number rose in the bones of the island like heat from a steam pipe. The tram moved again on its cable with a little jerk and then a smooth glide. Passengers inside cried and clapped and apologized to each other. The city made a collective sound that was not a cheer and not a sob. Something older. Something like a low chord from a temple where authorities have no jurisdiction. The mirror face tilted its head toward the island and brought a hand up in a slow arc. The surface of the mask reflected Naima, the bridge, the sky, the tram, the dark stripe of a barge slipping against current. It did not reflect the SUVs that nosed in behind a low brick building 2 blocks north, because that is not what it was interested in. Yelena reflected them instead, in a lens that did not forget, and a mind that held grudges with archival precision. The count hit 0. The river did not split. The bridge did not fall. The island did something stranger. It hummed back. A tone rose from the rock and the trees and the old hospital brick and the new glass. It met the number and offered the fraction Yelena had heard when she stabbed the drone. Harmony. The mirror face steadied. The lattice returned and hung in the air above the island like a delicate net made of the idea of scaffolding. Naima felt the instruction, inside her chest the way a runner feels the shift between struggle and rhythm. She nodded once. Theo rolled the dial into place. Yelena lifted her antenna toward the net like a conductor asking an orchestra to rise with her. The city took a breath it could share, and the gate began to draw itself in lines of light, above the river, with a neatness that made everyone who saw it feel both terrified and curious. They had 90 seconds, at most, to decide whether to open it or break. The Roosevelt Island took the sunset like a blade. The water ran copper under the tram line, and the old hospital ruin wore its broken windows like teeth. The number rose in the bones of the island, a steady lift under footfalls, a drum set in stone. People drifted toward the southern tip in currents of curiosity and dread. Naima moved through them with the calm of someone building a room inside a storm. She marked a circle on the pavement with borrowed chalk, then a second and a third, turning open plaza into a metronome. Breathe in for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. She did not have to raise her voice. The urgency rode on her shoulders and people felt it like weather. Theo lugged the oscillator case and a coil of cable that bit his palms. He kept seeing the rail under his ear, the hum that was not electricity but intention. The interface blinked ready. He knelt by a service panel that smelled like rust and heat, and fed the signal into a utility backbone that likely had not seen competent hands in years. The screen bounced between match and invert, then steadied. Harmonize hung amber like a promise he did not trust yet. The first swarm arrived low and slow, a cluster of black spheres skimming the tree line like fish scouting a dock. They did not fire. They mapped. The crowd tightened and loosened in waves. A jogger stopped mid-stride and forgot to breathe. A child pointed at reflections sliding across curved surfaces and told a parent that the sky looked like water. Naima's circle caught the nearest faces and gave them a job. Eyes on me, not on the horizon. The line in the chest is your instrument. The panic took one step back. The gate began to draw itself above the island, thin lines of light sketching a frame in the air. It was not a hole. It was an agreement, a geometry passing inspection. The lattice from earlier hung at the edge like scaffolding that could become either a bridge or a shield. The mirror face stood near the hospital ruin with the patience of a surveyor. The mask held the river, the tram, the arch across the way. It refused the drama of sirens and SUVs parking in discrete V formations behind a brick building up the road. Yelena found the handler on a roofline on the Manhattan side. By the way, he did not look at the show. He looked at people. He looked at the gaps in their attention. A low earbud, a throat mic, a jacket that wanted to be forgettable. She filmed the mess without flourish and stitched it to the van's plate and the earlier aerial. The evidence hung in her head with the clean edges of a file folder. She patched into a tangle of city feeds and listened for false orders. When they came, they arrived in perfect pronunciation and wrong cadence. She cut them where she could and flagged them when she could not. A voice told the island the bridge was unstable. Another told the crowd to move north. The crowd held because a woman in a navy jacket kept count on her fingers, and that simple math outpowered lies. The attack chose the moment the island reached a shared breath. Needles burst from a filament in the sky and rained like brittle glass. A hard light net snapped open above the circles. Naima felt the rhythm climb her spine and pushed her hands down, as if pressing invisible bellows. The first ring exhaled as one. The net bent off axis and the needles drifted sideways, punching sparks from a light pole and the corner of a bench instead of bone. A stroller caught a wheel on a crack and stuck. Naima did not break count. 2 volunteers slid in on her timing. Lifted, rolled, returned to the ring without looking back. Theo called out values without words. His hands turned the dial until the oscillator met a forward wave coming off the gate with a mirrored wave, ready to kiss it on the mouth. The two met and formed a thin shell above the plaza, like a soap film no one could see until it worked. A sphere hit it and fell out of the sky like a toy with a dead battery. Another hit and learned. It adjusted, tilted, searched for a frequency that would cut. Theo rode the kind of focus that makes time behave. Match held. Invert held. Harmonize crawled upward like a climber without rope. Yelena tracked the jammer van as it tried to come down the narrow road along the western edge. A new antenna rack had been taped under the bumper, an insult to both physics and taste. She had burned her only clean EMP shot, so she chose a different weapon. She called the number of a friend who used to answer to a title and never forgave the way certain departments behaved when a crisis could become a career opportunity. He did not pick up. She left him the plate, the street, the timestamp, and a line he would recognize as a debt coming due. Then she ran. The mirror face made its first decisive move. A line drew from its hand to the lattice and the scaffold brightened into a doorway. Not open, ready to be open. Through it came a new formation, plates in a V, edges so clean the eye wanted to bleed. The V pivoted and threw a curtain of hard light across the plaza, as if to test the contour of the crowd. Naima saw her people crack. She gave them something better than courage. She gave them a count. 4 up, 4 still, 4 down. The curtain rippled on contact with attention and slid away as if embarrassed. The handler on the far side shifted strategy. False orders thickened with just enough plausible detail to sound official. A claim about a gas leak. A warning about a second wave. Yelena cut 2, failed on 1, and watched the crowd lean. She shouted at a camera she did not control and used a word she tries never to use. Then she found a public address system she could hijack and fed it the count. Breath as broadcast. The island heard itself and the lean corrected. Theo reached Harmonize at 81% and hit the ceiling that had been there since morning. He saw the problem in the mistake he had been carrying all day. He had treated the city like an instrument he could play alone. He looked at Naima inside the chalk, at the people standing with their hands rising and falling in the same snow of air. He unplugged the oscillator from the panel and set it on the ground inside the ring. He asked the island to finish its own chord. The number changed. It did not leave 108.4. It learned a fraction that belonged only to this sliver of land, a harmony, written by brick, soil, and the long ache of a hospital that had watched too much. The shell above the plaza thickened. The gate flickered. The V formation adjusted and pressed. Spheres poured through on the edges and smacked the shell until they forgot how to fly. The mirror face tilted as if listening to a new instrument, and then added power. The doorway's lines steadied and began to bite into the air. Naima stepped to the inside edge of the ring. She could feel the moment where a choice wanted to be made. Open this and invite a language no one spoke yet. Break it and win a day while losing whatever came with understanding. She measured the faces around her. The boy from the tram. The older woman who had taken an inventory and then set a pace. A man in a suit who had found a better version of himself at the end of a line. She made the only decision that did not smell like ego. Hold the breath. Hold the shell. Deny entry without rage and without apology. Yelena reached the service road as the van's grill nosed into view. An SUV slid across to block it with a little too much choreography. Men stepped out with no patch and uniforms that looked like a mood rather than a job. The handler came down the fire escape and joined them, hands at his sides, eyes on the island. Yelena saw the conversation without hearing words. "We can keep your city quiet. We can turn a page for you." She took a photo that would matter later, then did a small, mean thing that mattered now. She sprayed the jammer's vent with the contents of a fire extinguisher and jammed a screwdriver where the rack met the chassis. The van coughed and went dumb for 6 heartbeats. The shell over the island brightened. The gate twitched and lost a line. The mirror face adjusted again, and for the first time looked less like a surveyor and more like a person making a bet. It lifted both hands. The mask rippled, failed to hold a reflection, found it again. Naima felt her knees try to shake and denied them. Theo tightened the oscillator's tie-in to the ground itself. The crowd in the rings breathed with a steadiness that embarrassed the panic in the air. The shell thickened enough to show a faint sheen. A single sphere reached the shell, wobbled, and went to sleep mid-air before dropping with a dull knock. The doorway collapsed in a neat implosion. The lattice folded like a tent packed by a professional. The V formation lifted and retreated, pivoting back toward the channel. The mirror face stepped backward without actually moving, and drained color from the mask until it looked more like river than glass. It held a pose that read as acknowledgement rather than defeat. The handler on the far side lit a cigarette he did not want and threw it away after one drag. The island exhaled. People cried without drama. Some laughed because there is always a spot in the brain that chooses humor when it survives. The chalk line scuffed under shoes and did not matter anymore, because the count had been taught and would be remembered. Naima found Theo and pressed her forehead to his for the briefest second, then backed away because anything longer would waste a resource they had to keep. Yelena sent a single frame to a place that still knew how to file things, then lowered her antenna, and let her arms hang like someone had just taken a bag off her back. The number did not stop. It softened and settled into the city like a thermostat set for winter. Radios across boroughs found 108.4 without touching their dials. Not a command, not even a call, just a way to hear yourself when the noise gets ambitious. The ruin threw a longer shadow. The tram crossed the sky on schedule, and people inside applauded for reasons the conductor did not need to understand. Night crawled up the river. The first stars fought with the city glow and lost, then tried again in a stubborn cluster over Queens. The handlers' SUVs peeled off in staggered pairs, empty of sirens and full of paperwork that would invent an alternate history. The van with the broken rack limped away. The mirror face thinned into air until the mask held only a suggestion of curve, and then nothing at all. The shell above the island dissolved into plain wind. Naima stood where the circle had been and felt the ache arrive in her legs and shoulders like interest on a loan. She let the ache be real, and did not rush to bury it. Theo closed the oscillator case with a carefulness normally reserved for instruments and small animals. Yelena climbed down from the roof and crossed the street without looking up for the first time all day. They had won an hour and lost nothing they could not spare. The city had learned a chord. Somewhere out there, another island, another bridge, another ruin was waiting to sing back. Morning came late and sideways. A gray smear dragged across a city that had spent its night pretending it knew how to sleep. Roosevelt Island felt emptied of adrenaline and full of aftershock. The number softened into infrastructure. A polite presence under traffic and boiler hiss. That was when the knives usually came out. Not alien knives. Paper ones, memos, briefings. Handsome men who wore their IDs on lanyards like jewelry. The handlers' SUVs returned without sirens and with better coffee. They set up a perimeter around nothing in particular, and then invented a reason to have done it. A portable mast went up near the tram terminal, with a panel label nobody outside a procurement office could parse. The mast did not carry the city's voice. It carried a patchwork of commands that would sound right until they mattered. Yelena caught it from a roofline and logged the packet pattern. She needed another proof, something that would live longer than a thread on a social feed. She needed one of the masks. Times Square tried to heal by replacing spectacle with bigger spectacle. Screens cycled to smiling ads, as if dental whiteness could erase where the iris had been. Street crews scrubbed scorch marks from beam uprights. Tourists stood where the mirror face had dropped and took photos of themselves reenacting terror like it was choreography. Above them, a new ripple rolled the wrong way across a billboard, as if someone had dragged a finger through liquid glass. Shards formed a curtain again, but the city had learned and braced without being told. People ducked with the grace of practice. A net snapped and missed its shape. The spheres strafed low, cutting cables and carving letters in metal that were not letters in any human alphabet. They did not hold. The tone coming off the district refused them. A neighborhood instinct without a leader. Naima moved the rig through midtown triage with a face that said her sleep debt belonged to a different person. She had a list of names from the island, and a set of new ones from the night that followed. The number made the scanner crackle like static every time she got near a subway entrance, which meant she lingered by stairs without saying why. She watched people choose. A bus driver opened both doors when he only had to open one. A food cart gave fruit to a line because money looked small and hands looked big. It should have been corny. It felt like survival. Theo chased the hum through access tunnels that smelled like mouse and spilled coffee and old secrets. He sketched nodes on a paper map because paper did not crash. The hum had lines now, not just loops. Lines converged in the financial district, where streets became canyons too narrow for the sky and perfect for resonance. He put his ear to a granite corner and heard the echo come back polished. The spheres loved that. He sprinted 3 blocks ahead of nothing and warned a crew he did not command to stand clear. They looked at his vest and his eyes and stood clear. The first glass storm of the day ran south on a tailwind, a cyclone of mirror flakes rotating in silence until it hit office tower facades and sang. The tone mounted until teeth hurt. The shards did not cut skin if your breath held steady. They cut cables, fiber, translucent banners, all the stuff a city strings between itself to pretend it is one piece. Theo pushed the oscillator into the canyon and matched to the turning until the storm sheared in half like a zipper opening down the street. The halves ate banner instead of bone and ran out of song. He found a shard the size of a dinner plate embedded in a planter. It did not look alien if you ignored the way it refused dust. It held a reflection of his hand with too much honesty, like a mirror you meet before coffee. He wrapped it in a maintenance cloth and carried it like contraband. On a hunch, he set it near the oscillator and watched the display shift a hair toward harmonize. Not a key, a resonator. He called Naima, who told him where she was without saying street names. He turned for the rig. Yelena dropped from a roof into the stale air of a service alley on the west side and followed the packet trail to a logistics garage that smelled like tires and policy. The van with the ruined rack sat inside under a tarp so insultingly casual, it felt like a dare. 3 men in matching casual looked at her like she was an email. The handler was not there. She asked for a clipboard because walking into a room with nothing in your hands makes people see you. Carrying something makes you invisible. She wrote a receipt number that referenced nothing and walked past them like she had earned the right to be bored. She opened the van door and met the smell of fried plastic and anger. The rack had been replaced. The sticker residue on the rear window told her the sports team was the kind you sponsor to wash a budget line. Inside the glove box, she found a lanyard for a shell corporation and a folded printout of an interop frequency plan. She photographed both with a phone that did not connect to anything and slipped out before anyone remembered to ask her name. On the plaza by the ruin, the island held morning classes in breathing without meaning to. People came back to the chalk instinctively and refilled it with their souls. An older man in a USPS cap set himself up as a greeter, the way some men set themselves up as barbers in war zones. He shook hands with a pat that standardized heart rate. Naima waited for the next wave without hoping there would not be one. Hope wastes time. She made a call to a number she had never used. A voice she recognized by posture answered. She asked for nothing except for the space to make a choice without assault from the people who pretended to protect choice. The voice did not promise. It suggested lunch. When the next wave came, it began where the city had been strongest. The highline grasses bowed and the rails hummed, but instead of a wall of swarm, the attack came as a scatter of needle drones set to negotiate eye level. They stayed out of the oscillator's kill cone and worked the edges. They snipped flags, tore up climbing ivy, ruined the day for a couple taking wedding photos. They wanted to cheapen the rhythm by binding it to everyday annoyance. It almost worked. Naima felt the rings wobble as people broke count to slap at machines the size of a thumb. She stepped into the field and took the hit instead, a needle breaking skin at the base of her throat like a bee with opinions. Pain exploded and then went thin. She set her hand on the speaker instead of the wound and increased volume one notch. The drones drifted like drunks and fell into the park grass with the silly dignity of a failed magic trick. Theo arrived at the rig with the shard and the weird feeling of carrying a part of a thing you did not understand. Naima watched the way light moved across it and fought the urge to flinch from her reflection. She put it on the rig hood and set the oscillator beside it. The display crept 2 ticks toward the good. She thought instrument again. She thought the city made these people a mirror because that was what it had on hand. The mirror can be shield, not just blade. She told Theo to bring it to the arch at dusk. Yelena followed the handler to a small meeting and watched the choreography from the dark of a stairwell. She read the men by how much space they allowed their shoulders. There were the ones who ate oxygen and the ones who brought notebooks. The handler stood between, a mediator for an argument no one was willing to hold out loud where a camera could steal it. He gave a PowerPoint that was not a PowerPoint, a story about continuity with enough adjectives to sell a dull murder. The phrase managed aperture came up twice. A third time it failed to arrive, which meant even he did not believe in it. Yelena filmed through a gap in the door and put her finger on the frame where the handler's throat moved. He swallowed when he said we. She filed this in the cabinet labeled weakness. By afternoon the number had gone quiet enough that people lied to themselves and called it over. Shops reopened with a bravado that teetered on terror. A child in a Spider-Man costume pantomimed batting spheres with webbing. A street preacher switched from apocalypse to gratitude mid-sermon, and made both convincing. The sky hardened into late light, and shadows made choices about allies. That was when the first obelisk appeared. It was not the DC monolith the conspiracy forums had settled on overnight. New York got a different version. A narrower slab of black, its edges less harsh, its surface less perfect. It rose from the East River off the piers like a thing remembering how to stand. No siren noticed it until the number threaded through their boards. The slab did not broadcast words. It threw a question with its presence, and out of every bridge joint and brick lintel, an answer vibrated. The question was whether the city wanted to be audited on purpose. The answer was a low chord that could have passed for a subway if you were lonely. Naima felt the cord travel from her sternum to her back and land behind her neck like a hand. She hated what it did to her eyes. It made them wet without asking. She imagined her father at a kitchen table with a cup of coffee explaining taxes and understood audit differently. An audit hurts worst when you have lied. She looked at the chalk faint underfoot and at Theo's shard, now propped like a makeshift shield. She decided to treat the obelisk as a guest she would not let into the bedroom. The handlers team chose the moment when the city cracked a door to shove in their boot. The new jammer came online, nested inside a legal transmitter, hiding in a citizen band nobody policed. It was too polite to be obvious. It shaved the tail off the number, stealing the part that helped breath finish neatly. People started losing the last beat of their count. Panic lives in missing beats. Yelena caught the theft by accident while scanning for something else. She sprinted 2 blocks and climbed a scaffold in a way that would embarrass her knees tomorrow. She reached the transmitter box and found 3 padlocks that did not match each other because 3 departments had wanted to own the box. She laughed once without humor and went at the rustiest lock with a pick, then the second with a tension wrench, then lifted the lid on the third because someone had left it open. She yanked a patch cable that did not belong. The number hit whole again, Somewhere in a quiet room, the handler swore in a language that did not translate to email. Spheres rushed the obelisk as if to test whether it had come alone. The slab absorbed their light and gave back nothing. It did not appear to enjoy violence or register it. It did what standing does. It created a reference. The mirror face stepped onto a pier and faced it as if greeting a colleague from a different department. Naima saw the way the mask reflected the slab and understood that the tools were talking to each other about a city like doctors speak over a sleeping patient. She hated the surgery metaphor but could not dodge it. Theo set the shard at the foot of the arch and watched the oscillator display tip to harmonize like a scale that had waited for one more apple. The shell overhead thickened before anyone asked it to. A ripple formed in the air 3 blocks south and thought about being a gate, then thought again. The obelisk kept its counsel. The handlers' cars idled and pretended to patrol. Yelena texted a photo of the open transmitter lid to a person who would appreciate the metaphor, and then did the pettiest thing she would do all day. She taped the lid shut and wrote property of the island in marker. Evening tried for grace and landed somewhere near dignity. People went home because enough had been learned for one cycle, and nobody gets extra credit for staying in class after the bell. The ruin held its long shadow. The tram moved without drama. The water chose black over copper. The number kept time like a drummer who has played through wars and weddings and knows the difference. The city carried a shard of mirror on its shoulder and felt a little heavier and a little more itself. By noon, the city had decided it could multitask the end of the world. Office lobbies resumed badge checks with the same board efficiency they used on snow days. Cafes invented mirror lattes with a streak of charcoal you were not supposed to ask about. The obelisk off the East River held its line like a tuning fork jammed into bedrock. It did not blink. The number rested under everything like a tendon. Theo walked south with the shard wrapped in cloth, the oscillator case banging his knee, and a hand-drawn diagram folded into his back pocket. The diagram was a subway map in pencil with an extra layer only he could hear. Nodes where the hum fattened, nodes where it thinned, paths where the city's rhythm ran clean, shortcuts where it cut across history and ignored zoning. The deepest convergence landed in the financial district where streets narrowed into stone canyons, and sound ran forward, hit polished faces, and came back organized. He set the shard at the base of a granite plinth engraved with a list of names that had meant something once and meant something else now. The oscillator display drifted toward harmonize without asking permission. He felt a flush of pride and pushed it down because pride served close to certainty, and certainty was how people got sloppy. He tuned the dial a fraction, and the air above the street put a sheen on itself that only a certain kind of eye could see. A courier slammed brakes at the edge of the sheen and swore in admiration because he had nearly invented a new way to break his collarbone. 2 blocks north, the first glass storm of the afternoon unrolled itself down an avenue like a silver carpet pushed by a cold wind. Shards rotated in tight formation without touching and sang at a frequency that tightened jaw hinges. It hit the sheen and split like water around a rock, then rejoined itself with the stubborn discipline of weather. Theo shifted his weight to anchor the case against the curb as if physics respected posture. The storm passed and sloughed off into a lesser street where it wasted its temper on lawn signs and an abandoned sandwich board. Naima worked a corridor of triage that stretched from a church that smelled like candles to a lobby that smelled like carpet cleaner. She had slept 90 minutes on the rig bench and sat up with a back that told the truth. Her neck wore a puncture the size of a freckle, where a needle drone had tried to edit her. She ignored both. Breath counts moved with her like a tide. The chalk lines in her mind had spread. Rings drawn on sidewalks and foyers and the lips of subway mouths. She put a hand on a shoulder, and people met her without the fuss of gratitude. That was the luxury of a city now. No speeches. Work. Midday brought a different kind of swarm. Not spheres. Not drones. People in field uniforms that borrowed authority by shape and shade. They positioned themselves where cameras would flatter their angles. The handler did not appear. His work happened one layer deeper, under crossbeams where acoustics made whispers strong. A portable mast rose over a plaza with a label that implied federal and meant nobody. Yelena watched from the roofline of a bank. That was a bank in the way a set is a hospital. She filmed packet patterns again and paced the size of the security footprint. She could feel the shape of a public story being built. A narrative with a villain subtle enough to keep budgets flowing, and a hero bland enough to survive a Senate hearing. The obelisk decided to act by doing what it had done since it arrived. It stood. The act was in the way the number rode its mass and reached further into the city's lattice. Emergency radios ticked to 108.4 and back, as if clearing their throats. Elevator control boards blinked a diagnostic sequence that sounded like the first bar of a song, and then returned to normal. Traffic lights held an all red for one extra beat, and turned the usual reckless dash into the kind of pause that stops two fenders from shaking hands. Naima felt the change in her lungs. The breath ended cleanly. Mute noticed the same thing with the aggrieved focus of a landlord losing a creative accounting tactic. By 1 o'clock, the financial district hummed like a transformer warming before a storm. Theo traced the hum to a seam in the street where an old trolley line had once run. He cracked a utility cover and fed the oscillator into the bones. The display quit flirting with Harmonize and committed. The sheen stepped off the curb and became a dome. High over Broadway, a ripple thought about becoming a gate. It hesitated as if waiting for the city to say please. That was new. The mirror face arrived at the lip of the plaza with the ease of a gull landing on a seawall. The mask held the dome as a perfect curve. Its posture read as interested rather than predatory. Spheres ranged behind it like a bored honor guard. Naima moved into the open and did not bother with hand signals. The mirror face was not a dog and she was not a trainer. She stood where the number landed strongest and let the instrument use her as a stand. The crowd took a collective half-step back without taking a full step that would smell like fear. The handlers team chose the moment for their own entrance, because men like that loved page marks. A convoy flowed into the far end of the street and fanned into a wedge. Two cutoffs formed a pocket around the portable mast. The mast fed a jammer layered inside a legal transmitter one license shy of accountability. The interference did not chop the number. It rounded its edges, shaved its tail, introduced enough slop to make breath finish ragged. People started losing the last beat. Panic lives there. Yelena swore without moving her lips and measured the padlock family on the mast box. 3 locks again, each branded by a different fiefdom. She felt a grim generosity toward the bureaucracy that had accidentally kept her enemies from turning the key. She slid down a ladder that an engineer had never considered for a person wearing boots instead of a harness, and went at the box with a set of picks that had survived 3 apartments and a breakup. She popped the old Union lock, finessed the new city lock, discovered the federal lock was fake, and pulled a patch that hummed with a smugness she could feel in her molars. The number snapped back into perfect measure. Somewhere a comms captain threw a pen the way a kid throws a toy when the batteries die. The obelisk took that as permission. The dome above the street shivered and set, a thickness you could feel when you stepped into it. The forming gate stabilized a seam barely wide enough for a person. The mirror face turned slightly, and offered the seam as if holding open a door for a neighbor. Naima read a choice without a line of dialogue. Open now on the city's terms and learn, or hold now and make them try again somewhere dirtier. She did not pretend to carry the whole vote in her chest. She looked at faces, an underpaid clerk still in badge and black shoes, a bike messenger whose calves carried the day, a woman in flats and a powerhouse suit who had been crying and then decided not to. The clerk nodded because nodding was free. The messenger shrugged in a way that meant why not die learning. The woman raised a hand to smooth her hair and left it in the air like a vote. Naima lifted a palm and angled it down, the same motion she used to lower a bed rail. Hold. The crowd exhaled on 4. Theo dialed invert a hair into the harmonic, and the seam shivered like a caution. The mirror face accepted without sulk. It did not feel like victory. It felt like setting a boundary with someone who understood boundaries. Mute did not. The handler shifted to a different play. The jammer cut in short bursts, shaving microseconds, not beats. Enough to fray tempers. Enough to make people bump shoulders wrong and decide the bump was an insult instead of physics. He seeded a rumor into a channel Yelena could not plug. A gas leak. A second gate. An evacuation order that named a block where people could not go because the block did not exist. The rumor drifted like pollen. Some mouths opened. Some fists tried shape. Naima moved through it and stole momentum the way you steal a ball you never stop running with. She assigned tasks by eye. You with the hat start count on this ring. You with the cargo shorts guide people left without touching them. You with the 100-yard stare. Sit on that curb and count for yourself until the world shrinks to the size of your chest. It worked well enough. Then the city tried to add something human. The church door opened and a choir stepped out because they had been practicing anyway. And who were they? If not a machine for putting breath into a pattern. They sang without microphones into wind and sirens, and the kind of interference that is older than both. The number shifted a hair to meet them. The dome thickened another fraction. The gate seam regained its line and held. A sphere shot forward like a wasp that resented art and hit the dome at a bad angle. It spun and fell, dumb metal for a moment, and people laughed because laughter is a medicine that cheats at dosage. Theo considered the shard like a chess piece he had been saving. He set it on a bollard, where it could reflect both the obelisk and the mirror face. The display rolled its eyes at him in numbers, and slid the dome toward a sweet spot he had not been able to hit with dial alone. He had the feeling you get when the wrench finally fits the stuck nut, because you have been using the wrong hand for 20 minutes. He said sorry in his head to the part of him that liked being the smartest apparatus in the room. The mirror face advanced one step, and the mask failed for a full second to hold any reflection. That was new enough to be frightening. When it regained surface, the curve stuttered in the way of a person suppressing emotion. Hard light plates formed in a V over its shoulder, and pivoted into a testing weave that licked the dome. The weave did not cut. It did rake. Sparks jumped. Street banners fluttered and surrendered letters. Theo kept the line. Naima kept the breath. The choir modulated up one half step like a stubborn barge deciding it would make this tide work. From the corner of her roofline, Yelena caught a figure she had not expected. Not the handler. A woman too composed to be staff and too present to be executive. She wore a coat the color of decisions, and walked through the team as if they were furniture. She spoke into the handler's ear, and he winced in a way that said she outranked his consequences. Yelena zoomed and caught a badge flashed the way a magician flashes a coin. The letters blurred, but the seal did not. She filed it under friends you will not want and enemies you will need. The obelisk dimmed, then brightened, then dimmed again. It was not theatrical. It was diagnostic. The number tested load and margin and tolerance for chaos. It found a band of safety and held there like a surgeon choosing smaller strokes. Naima felt the decision in her body and did not argue. The gate seam lost its ambition and smoothed into air. The V formation spun and returned to altitude over the river. The mirror face rotated its mask half an inch, a gesture that felt like acknowledgement or boredom, or both. It receded. The handler closed his box and packed his mask with the tight body language of a man pulling off a ring. His team rolled their wedge backward without a siren to justify it. The city exhaled, not in a cheer, but in the quiet way a room empties after a hard meeting. The choir went back inside because practice runs until it stops. The bike messenger popped his jaw and asked a stranger for gum without words. The woman in the suit looked at the obelisk like a person assessing a neighbor's new dog. Then the number did a tiny thing only people who had been listening since morning would have caught. It added a grace note, flick at the edge of hearing. Yelena grabbed it with a software net and parsed it to text out of habit, knowing it would not be text. It was a coordinate with fewer numbers than math prefers, and more meaning than numbers usually carry. The arch under the bridge again. Dusk again. Bring what you took. She glanced at Theo's shard and then at the obelisk, and felt the pattern come up. Off the board like a trap about to close on someone too clever to admit. Naima looked at the rig clock and the horizon, and the faces of people who had been promoted to citizens by a disaster. She weighed the cost of one more stand against the price of refusing to show up. She hated how simple the math was. She nodded at Theo without actually nodding. He wrapped the shard in the cloth as if tucking in a child. Yelena sent 3 messages to 3 different people who did not like each other, and told each one truth, in a way that would make them think she was lying. It was the only way to get all 3 to come. The city moved toward evening with that bizarre steadiness only places with too many hearts can manage. The obelisk kept its place. The handler's convoy ghosted upriver like a school of fish that had decided they were sharks again. The mirror face became thinner than a thought and then nothing at all. The dome dissolved into the same air it had made stronger. The number faded to a hum that sat at the base of everything like a tendon under skin. A boy kicked a piece of dead drone into the gutter where it belonged. The next lesson waited where lessons always wait in New York, under a bridge in the half-light, where you can decide with your hands instead of your ideology. Dusk pulled a long bruise across the East River and set the bridge cables glowing like strings tuned to a key no orchestra had used before. The arch threw a cool cave of air over the street. Footsteps sounded wrong here, too loud and too private at the same time. The chalk from the first day had worn to a ghost, but the stone remembered the circle, even if the eye did not. Naima arrived first with the rig, shoulders squared. The puncture at her throat faded to a dot. Theo came with the oscillator and the shard wrapped in cloth like a relic. Yelena slid out of the kind of shadow that exists only for people who practice with it. The number sat under everything, polite and firm. The obelisk off the river held steady at half brightness and half patience. Bystanders drifted at a respectful distance, some out of awe, some out of calculation. A camera drone bobbed above a rooftop, until a stern look from a firefighter made it reconsider its life choices. The handler's convoy did not advertise itself, but you could track it by the way traffic politely failed near 3 side streets. The city had learned how to hold a breath without hurting its own chest. It was about to need that skill. Theo laid the shard at the base of the arch. The oscillator display ticked toward Harmonize as if relieved to see an old friend. He set the case on its rubber feet and racked the dial to 108.4, then leaned in a fraction more to meet what the island had taught them. The air above the stones picked up a sheen. You could miss it if you insisted on pretending everything was normal. Narima pressed her palm to the stone where the circle had been, and felt the soft thump come back through skin rather than ear. She counted inside her mouth where no one could see it. 4 up, 4 still, 4 down. She nodded to herself once the way a carpenter nods at a frame that will hold. The mirror face arrived by thickening in the space between 2 breaths. Surface first, shape second. The mask held the bridge and the water and the city lights, but tonight there was a fault line in the reflection. A thin seam that blurred for a heartbeat before snapping back to perfect. Behind it a V of plates formed at altitude. Edges clean enough to make a dentist jealous. Spheres drifted behind the V like a rumor waiting to happen. The gate began to draw itself without flourish, a neat rectangle of light the color of mathematics. It did not tear. It unfolded. The lattice slid into place at the edges and looked for permission. Theo matched and inverted by muscle memory and then stopped himself. The habit had saved them, and now it could break the instrument. He backed the dial a hair and let the platform of sound be built by the ground rather than his hands. The display rewarded him by holding steady without begging for input. The handler chose that exact second to introduce trouble into the final act. A low transmitter came alive in a maintenance cabinet that had belonged to a different era of the city. It shaved the grace note off the number with an elegance that made the sabotage feel like craft. Breath stumbled at the last beat. Panic lives there. Yelena was already moving. She vaulted a railing, hit a ladder, dropped into a pencil corridor that smelled like oil and old argument. The cabinet had 3 locks again. The fake federal sat proud. She twisted the union lock with a pick until it surrendered with a little hiss. The city lock tried to be coy and failed. She opened the door and found a patch cable that did not deserve the quality of its connectors. She pulled it and threw it into the dark like a snake. The last beat returned. Somewhere a man whispered a curse that sounded like he had just discovered the tipping point of his own career. The V formation pivoted and laced a weave of hard light across the arch, testing angles on the dome that was not yet a dome. Sparks skittered down the stone like ants. The weave did not press. It sampled. Lima stepped forward into the sampling and let it measure a person who had decided that fear was not an interesting hobby. The weave shifted to find a softer edge, and found the rings her circles had trained into strangers' chests citywide. People at the perimeter caught the rhythm voluntarily, shoulders rising and falling in sync without looking at each other. Some laughed at themselves for doing it, and kept doing it because it worked. The gate thickened to a threshold you could not walk through yet, like the held breath before a promise. Theo set the shard upright against the case to catch the obelisk and the mask in the same plane. The display rolled toward a sweet spot he would have failed to hit with dial alone. Harmonize arrived with the quiet click of a door latching in a well-built house. Above them, the air tightened into a shell thin enough to see through, and thick enough to matter. Spheres moved to probe. The first hit and dropped dead weight onto the pavement with a sound every engineer recognizes as compliance. The second tried a different vector and learned the same lesson. The mirror face steadied. The mask lost the city for a full second. When it returned, the reflection carried a shimmer like heat over asphalt. It lifted one hand and the threshold brightened a notch that felt like consent. The city had earned an opening on its own terms. For a moment, the future presented itself like a clean page. A choice moved across Naima's shoulders and asked to be chosen. Yelena saw motion at the edge of the scene that did not belong to physics. The handler stepped from a knot of men with faces like inboxes and walked toward the cabinet she had just cleaned. He did not look at the arch because he did not have time to be impressed. He had time to interrupt. He touched his ear, and two men peeled off to flank him with the body language of instruments rather than humans. Yelena cut across their path with a photographer's arrogance, the kind that pretends to belong until it does. She smiled without warmth and drifted close enough to hear his voice. He was speaking to no one present, and everyone who might pay him later. Managed aperture, civic continuity, messaging cadence. She filed the phrases the way you file cuts on your hands after a day of hard work. The obelisk pulsed, and the shell over the arch thickened. The threshold took on the geometry of a door, with a handle you could not see but would recognize if you reached out. Naima weighed the opening with the sober eye of a medic deciding whether to crack a chest curbside. She looked at Theo. His hands were steady on the case. He would do what the place required, and then fix what broke later. She looked at Yelena. Yelena's eyes were moving like a chess clock. She would catch the betrayal before it mattered, and expose it after. Naima looked at the faces at the perimeter. A city shows itself at a threshold. What she saw was not hunger for spectacle, or the soft love of an easy answer. She saw people who would clean up after themselves if you told them where the brooms were. She raised her hand and held it at shoulder height, palm down. Hold, the mirror face did not flinch. The mask rippled like water over metal. The V above dipped and pressed a touch harder, as if to check whether resolve could be confused with paralysis. The shell held. The first plate sparked and stepped back. The threshold flickered but did not die. It felt like a stalemate you could live with. The handler broke the stalemate with a new tactic. Not a jammer this time. A siren recorded and rebroadcast with a timing offset of half a beat. The offset created a drag that made every breath feel a hair late. It was subtle and filthy. People started to step on each other's counts. Shoulder bumps hardened into misinterpretations. Yelena swore in a language that was not English or Russian, and went looking for the speaker. She found it bolted under a municipal bench with smug hardware. She could not reach it. A teenager in a delivery jacket climbed up her back like a ladder without asking, and tore the box down with the casual grace of a person who learned balance dodging doors and bikes. He grinned, handed her the unit, and jogged away into anonymity with the blessed selfishness of youth. Theo felt the shift in the oscillator before the display caught it. He realized the shell had been carrying all the weight. That was wrong. The shell was never meant to be a lid. It was meant to be a bell. Bells want a striker. He took his hands off the dial and set both palms on the stone. The number moved through him like a patient thing finally finding an open vein. The shell spread its load across ground, water, bridge metal, hospital ruin, and everything human standing on the stones. The strain evened. The edge of the threshold softened from a hard rectangle to a curve with better manners. The mirror face took one step forward. For a heartbeat it held no reflection at all. The mask went the color of breath on a cold morning. When the city came back on its surface, it arrived a half-second late and then caught up. Something on the other side of that face had learned to lag. It was a small failure, and therefore important. Naima understood what it said about the audit. The alien instrument functioned perfectly when the place could not hear itself. It fumbled when confronted with coherence. The V above unrolled into a sheet, and came down with the slow inevitability of weather. It was not an attack. It was a test you could fail by assuming it was an attack. Naima did not flinch. She spread her fingers and pressed down. The rings at the perimeter picked up her posture the way crows pick up a shiny object. The sheet met the shell and sizzled along it, looking for a bargain. It found only process. It pulled back, reconfigured, and tried a slicing motion that had ruined stone and steel 2 days ago. The cord from the obelisk met the slice and smoothed it, like a hand across a wrinkle. It was not a rejection. It was a repair. The handler saw his window closing, and sent a man toward the shard with the kind of speed that says you have already prepared your apology. Naima saw him late because her body was a weather station, and the weather was busy. Yelena saw him early, because she had been trained by a city that weaponizes peripheral vision. She stepped in front of the shard without drama, and offered the man the flat stare you use when asking a dog if it is sure about the couch. He reached anyway. Theo stepped to her shoulder, not to fight, just to stand. The man recalculated. Somewhere behind him a voice made a new plan that involved failure metrics and a tax write-off. The threshold reached its maximum shape and held. It was not a hole. It was a mirror with a door implied in its depth. On its surface the city looked like itself. In its depth the city looked like a place that could have happened if different people had chosen different things. The mirror face stood between those images like a librarian deciding which room to unlock. It raised a hand. The mask failed for the longest time yet, and then recovered with a shimmer that admitted effort. The hand went down. The gate did not open. Silence arrived with its own sound, the kind that lands after a verdict and before the papers get signed. Dugima let her arm fall and looked at the people around her. No one had won anything you could hold up, and no one had lost anything they could not afford to lose. The shell began to thin. The V lifted and broke back into plates that took altitude, and became stars you could blame on the weather. The obelisk dimmed to a patient ember. The numbers settled into bone and brick and calmed like a violinist lowering the bow. The handler gathered his losses into folders and faces. His team folded their perimeter as if embarrassed by its symmetry. He glanced once at the shard, and then at Yelena, and then at the arch. He tried a smile on the face he wore for Lower Manhattan, and abandoned it because it made him look like a man at a bad wedding. He walked away with the dignity of a person who loves paperwork more than result. Yelena sent a packet of images and notes to 3 addresses that hated each other. For a moment, she enjoyed imagining the fights those emails would start in rooms she would never see. Then she closed her phone and put her hands on the stone to confirm she was still in a world that rewarded touch over narrative. Theo powered down the oscillator with the care you give a tired animal. He wrapped the shard and slid it back into the cloth, then reconsidered, and left a corner exposed so the stone could see itself for a while longer. Naima moved through the small injuries and large silences with the posture that signals an end, that is not a finish. She did not give a speech. She checked a pulse that did not need checking and announced a stable that no manual had prepared her to define. People drifted away, because dinner had to be cooked and homework had to be decided between attempted and honest. A child asked if the city had passed the test, and a parent said the city had taken the test together, and that was maybe better. A saxophonist at the edge of the arch played 3 notes and stopped, as if to acknowledge that some music does not want company. The bridge kept its cables, dumb as ever and smarter than anyone admits. Night took the edges off the scene. The obelisk stayed where it was, a dark punctuation in the river grammar. The number did not vanish. It eased into the chores of a place that has decided not to die just yet. Lights cycled. Elevators rested at even floors. A traffic light held red an extra heartbeat at an intersection that had already seen too much luck. In Brooklyn, a woman finished a shift and found her breath landing clean for the first time since Monday, and did not know why. In Queens, a bus driver took a corner without crunching his mirror, and chalked it up to practice. Under the arch, the chalk of the old circle finally gave up, and became dust. The stone kept the memory. Theo put a palm there one last time, and felt the echo come back honest. Yelena stood on the curb and listened to the absence of lies. Naima looked at the water and accepted that sleep would not fix everything, but refusing to try would fix nothing. She started the engine of the rig. The mirror shard caught a last smear of sunset and gave it back without editorial. The city had not won a war, because there was no war to win. It had learned an instrument. It had turned a frequency into a practice. It had said no to a door and yes to a rhythm. The thing with the mask had been forced to work in a place that could hear itself, and that alone was a rescue. Somewhere up the river, another obelisk considered standing. Somewhere down the coast, another city listened to its own rails for the first time, and liked what it heard. The audit would continue. The response would too. On the archstones, barely loud enough to register as sound, the number added a grace note you could feel under your ribs. It did not spell anything. It said the same thing it had said since the first water stood up like glass. Listen. Then the river breathed, the bridge held, and New York answered with a pulse that belonged to no single person, and to everyone who had learned where to put their hands.